Hello everybody, and welcome to the bonus section for the first part of Chapter 2. In this section, we're going to start exploring some of the characters more in depth. We'll take a look at their personalities, what we know about them, any motivations they might have had for any crimes that have been committed so far, and take a look at some of their inspirations, people from history or other characters from fiction that might have inspired their portrayals in this game. Let's start with your and my favorite English-accented, incredibly arrogant archaeologist, sort of like an Indiana Jones with a chip on his shoulder. I can only, of course, be talking about Dr. Pippin Carter. Dr. Carter was the discoverer of the Dagger of Amon-Ra, along with an entire cache of treasures and artifacts, in a long-buried ancient Egyptian temple. His probably already prodigious ego has grown to enormous proportions because of this important discovery, and his, some would say, theft of the dagger from the Egyptian authorities has angered at least two of the characters, Dr. Smith and Mr. Najir. Dr. Carter is probably not our first suspect for the actual theft of the Dagger of Amon-Ra, seeing as he would probably benefit most by having it continue on its worldwide tour. However, it could be alleged that the theft of the dagger might have been motivated by a desire to increase the popularity for his Egyptology exhibit. After all, an exhibit which had been burglarized would certainly seem to be of a high value, and curious people might have attended in order to see the scene of the crime. Or in fact, it could be that he's something of a greedy collector. It was known that many archaeologists of Egyptian and other sites at the time kept certain prize artifacts for themselves. Now, it's not exactly clear why Dr. Carter would wait until putting the artifact in a museum exhibit to steal, but the possibility remains nonetheless. Because of his immense ego, it's probably unlikely that Dr. Carter has many true friends. However, some people certainly do seem to tolerate him better than others. In particular, Dr. Carrington seems to have an appreciation for Dr. Carter, or at the very least for the money and tourists that his Egyptian exhibit is bringing to the museum. Yvette Delacroix seems to have an appreciation for his accomplishments as an archaeologist, although this could be just her usual flattery. And Ziggy at least appreciates a well-executed heist, which is what this may have amounted to. On the other side of the coin, Dr. Smith and Dr. Najir both clash immediately and fairly personally with Dr. Carter. Everybody else seems to think of him in sort of a generally negative term, which is understandable because of, like I said, his immense ego. And in the hypothetical case that we're going to see some murders this evening, it would be, if not probable, at least conceivable, that he would take physical action against anyone that he perceived as being a threat to his Egyptian exhibit or having stolen the Dagger of Amon-Ra. One of the themes of the 1920s that the Dagger of Amon-Ra successfully draws upon is the Egyptology craze of the time. High society, and in fact the mass of people in the Americas and Europe at least, were very interested in ancient Egypt, in its practices, its peoples, and the history associated with it, in part because Egyptian archaeology was proving to be the most fruitful and spectacular branch of the science. There were great lost temples being discovered, ancient artifacts, and such alike. Dr. Carter is based on the archaeologists of this period in general, but we'll focus on two as sort of being the inspiration for him. The most obvious inspiration for Dr. Carter, or Dr. Pippin Carter, would be the real-life archaeologist, Dr. Howard Carter. It's even alluded in-game that they're supposed to be brothers. Howard Carter might be the most famous real-life archaeologist of all time. He was born in London, England, but spent most of his time in the Norfolk town of Swaffham, probably because of his ill health. At age 17, he was sent to Egypt to assist in the archaeological excavation of Middle Kingdom tombs. Even from this young age, he was very creative in methods and practices for finding buried and lost tombs, and began innovating and improving the science of archaeology in terms of tomb detection. Later, he was made the first chief inspector of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, where it's known that he greatly improved the protection and access to archaeological dig sites. He resigned from this position after taking the side of Egyptian laborers in a dispute between Egyptian laborers and French tourists. The most important find of his life was definitely the discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut in the popular media. He found this tomb in the employ of Lord Carnarvon. It's kind of an interesting story, actually. He began work in the Valley of Kings in 1914, but was interrupted by World War I breaking out and had to delay for a few years. After that, Carter searched fruitlessly for 5 years in the Valley of Kings, coming up with nothing. Lord Carnarvon was getting frustrated and offered him one more season of funding. And it took him until November 4th of that year, so just right under the wire, to report the finding of the steps leading to Tutankhamun's tomb, which was by far the best preserved and most intact pharaonic tomb, the tomb of the pharaoh, that had been located at that point in time. He sent off for Lord Carnarvon to be present and made a, quote, tiny breach in the top left corner of the doorway. He was able to look in with a candle and see the glint off of the gold and ebony, indicating that the treasures were still intact. Famously, Lord Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" To which Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The clearance and cataloging of all the artifacts in the tomb continued for the next 10 years. This finding really made Carter's career, and he retired from archaeology and became a part-time agent for collections and museums. Interestingly, many people who were involved with the excavation and removal of artifacts from the tomb suffered early and unnatural deaths, resulting in some discussion of a curse of the pharaoh, or curse of the mummy. People who disbelieve in the curse of the mummy often point out that Carter himself lived for many years afterwards and died of natural causes. You would think if anyone in particular would have been afflicted by such a curse, it would be the man who first opened the tomb and in fact was responsible for its discovery. Now, Howard Carter is the positive model for the archaeologist that's most like Dr. Pippin Carter, and I'm sorry to say that even he himself is not removed from suspicion of misdeeds. It's becoming alleged, and finding more and more mainstream approval as time goes on, that Dr. Carter, for instance, helped himself to artifacts taken from dig sites for his personal collection and for smuggling them out of the country, both for paying collectors and as gifts for friends and family and things like that. And that he in fact broke seals on tombs, desecrated them before they could be presented to the public, and tried to pass it off as the work of tomb robbers. The 1920s was an era of great interest in archaeology, but a lot of the methodology hadn't yet been codified as a field, and more or less anyone who had the funds was able to consider themselves an archaeologist and excavate dig sites. One of Howard Carter's enduring legacies, in fact, is the increased precision and scientific method that he brought to archaeology and to dig sites in general. But that certainly doesn't mean that he was perfect or immune from the excesses of his era. For instance, he probably never took a sledgehammer to the door of a tomb trying to break it down and get the artifacts. However, lest you think that that's a gross exaggeration, perhaps done for comic purposes to illustrate how bad Pippin Carter was, which it may have been, you should keep in mind that this would by no means make him the worst or most egregious, destructive archaeologist of his time. And so, for our second model of archaeology, let's take a quick look at Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann was born before Carter was, in 1822, and was the son of a pastor who was so unpopular that his parishioners would throw things at him, and he had to move at one point in time to protect himself. Heinrich's father enrolled him in German grammar school, where he became enamored with the works of Homer, specifically the Iliad and the Odyssey. Heinrich supposedly was able to learn a new language in 6 weeks, and certainly became a wealthy businessman in America. His brother struck it rich in the California gold rush, and Heinrich moved out to start a bank in Sacramento that bought and resold over $1 million of gold dust in about 6 months. However, he left somewhat in a hurry in the wake of allegations about short-weight consignments. There was some allegation of fraud in his business dealings, in other words. Also, his personal diaries recount a number of stories which are provably false. He claims that he dined with President Millard Fillmore and his family, and a friend of his attests that this wasn't true, that he only read about it in the papers. He also writes in his diary that he was a witness to the Great San Francisco Fire of 1851, which he said took place in June, but actually happened in May. And anyway, at the time, he was provably in Sacramento, so clearly there is some element of fraud and bluff in his business dealings, and bizarrely enough, his personal life, the things he wrote in his personal diary. Nonetheless, he was a profitable importer and exporter, and became wealthy because of that business. Now, I mentioned before that he'd had a lifelong love of the works of Homer, and decided that he wanted to excavate the historical city of Troy and prove to people that it was more than just a fiction made up by Homer, which was actually what was thought at the time. And Schliemann picked up where archaeologist Frank Calvert had left off. Calvert had actually done some excavation at that site before, but came away disappointed with his findings. Well, it was known that there were many strata at this site, with different strata accumulating over time, and so different civilizations, different cities would be in different strata. Schliemann reasoned, if you can call it that since Troy was probably really old, because it was written about a really long time ago, it would probably be at the bottom of the 9 strata that they were able to find. Using this preconception, he literally dynamited his way through the top 8 strata to get to the bottom one, where he did uncover a number of artifacts, including a cache of jewels that he said probably belonged to Helen. In fact, the artifacts that he found were from a city that was probably about 1,000 years older than the one described in Homer's epic, and he had in fact dynamited his way right through historical Troy. This destroyed much of the ancient city, and kind of a lot of what we could have found has been destroyed because of his dynamiting practice. The trench created by the dynamiting is still there, named Schlieman's Trench, and before too long it was definitively proven by using some of the pottery found that the strata that he had excavated was from the early Mycenaean era. Much of his nomenclature is still used today for the artifacts in the strata that he discovered, which sort of credit them to being the Troy found in the Iliad, even though those are provably false. So just in general, this was an incredibly destructive method of archaeology, aimed solely at picking out the one era of Troy's history that this man was interested in. He knew, even assuming that he had found the correct era of Troy, he just completely destroyed all relics from, any other strata, including anything else interesting that they might have found. So he really stands as more or less the ultimate testament to the sort of destructive, hobbyist, rich person archaeology of the era. So there you have it. There's our 2 archaeological models for Dr. Pippin Carter. He was probably even a little better of an archaeologist than Heinrich Schliemann, a little worse than his brother Howard Carter. But whatever you can say about his archaeological technique, he surely has an enormous chip on his shoulder and is rife with possibilities, perhaps even for murder. We will have to find out in future updates. Alright, thanks for tuning in. See you guys later.